And when Fortier, when those two letters that Fortier includes in this article do include first-person plural forms, they take the 1-0 pattern, as you can see in 19. And then we find the same thing in the Houssaye text, the 1888 novelette by Sylvie de la Houssaye, in 20 through 22, and I think it should be adequately clear that each of these examples has to be read as a singular. So this is, of course, a very striking departure from the Acadian pattern, in which Javon is attested as a first-person plural. And so in the examples from Fortier and Houssaye, and all of those for which it has to be either first-person singular or first-person plural, all of them have to be first-person singular. There are none of them where the context would require a first-person plural reading. There are some that are ambiguous, but I think in the context of these, it becomes clear that they are, in fact, in my view, all first-person singular in these two texts. If you go on to the second page then, in 23 we have an example from Fortier of what I call the on avant pattern, in this case it's on décision, so the subject pronoun with an overtly marked plural verb. And we get a second peculiarity then illustrated in 24 and 25 on the handout. We get the verb form in 24, vous avions, so we get the on suffix attached to a verb form when the subject is vous. And in 25, la cérémonie étions finie. So we get étions instead of était for a third-person singular verb. So the second departure, or the second striking feature anyway of these historical Louisiana attestations is a proliferation of the use of on. There's another text that does this as well, and I haven't included any examples from on the handout, but there is an article by a Creole writer named Marguerite Ronan. In 1927, she published an article in the Compte Rendu de Louisiana. She doesn't have any javon per se. She doesn't have anywhere je is a subject pronoun with an avant form, but she does have the overtly marked verb forms with the subject il as a singular, with the subject tu, and with the subject on. So these texts seem to document an interesting proliferation of the use of this on form. So these Louisiana sources contain these two striking departures. First of all, the Javon is attested as a first-person singular, and second of all, there's a proliferation in the use of the suffix. We find the same kinds of things going on in the examples from the song texts listed in 26 and 28. I don't think I have time to discuss those examples during the question period. So I've summarized the data in Table 2 on the handout. You can see which sources attest which of these patterns. Well, as it turns out, if we take a closer look at maritime Acadian, the Canadian maritime provinces, and at rural speech material from France, we find that the use of Javon as a singular is not quite as odd as it might have seemed at first. There is, in fact, a single maritime Acadian text that I have encountered, which does include some examples of Javon as a first-person singular. And these are all from letters that are written by a woman who goes by the name of Marichette, who sent letters to the editor of the L'Angevin, which is a Nova Scotia newspaper, between the years 1895 and 1898. There are 13 of these letters. They were collected and published in a critical edition by Pierre Gérin and Pierre-Anne Gérin in 1982. And Marichette's letters include a number of Javon as first-person plural, but there are also some that are incontested in first-person singular. And the editors of this critical edition are quite aware of how much this is a departure from the Acadian norms. In their view, Marichette is going heavy on local color, in their terminology. So whatever the case, it clearly is true that the vast majority of the material on maritime Acadian shows the Javon pattern only as a first-person plural, not as a first-person singular. When we turn to examples from France, then we also find that there are occasional and sporadic attestations of the Javon pattern as a first-person singular rather than a first-person plural. We have examples of that in 32 through 38 on the handout. However, linguists and grammarians are sort of divided over the question of whether or not these are authentic. And a number of people have expressed the view that back when the Javon pattern was actually in productive use in rural speech in France, it could only occur as a first-person plural. And so these examples then, and many others like that, would be considered anomalies, which would require some kind of explanation. And in fact, several explanations have been offered. So, for example, Frédéric Deloff, in his critical edition of the Agréable Conférence text from the mid-17th century in the rural speech around the Paris region. And the Acadian-style also includes a number of attestations, not only of plural jabot, but also singular jabot. And in de L'Offre's view, this is a plural of majesty. Now, I'm not sure the plural of majesty explanation or royal we is able to account for all of the data, although it does seem to work particularly well for 32 on your handout. This is, in fact, King François Ier speaking, so it seems to lend itself rather well to the plural of majesty interpretation, but I'm not convinced that works for much of the rest of the data. A second explanation that is sometimes put forth is that, as we know, in 17th and 18th century French literature, the use of dialect or patois that we find in literature of that period is usually in burlesque literature or satirical literature. So some linguists and grammarians have suggested that when we find occurrences of jabot and that kind of material, that it is a satirical deformation of rural speech intended for comedic effect. Not everyone espouses that view either. Théodore Rottet, in his 1911 study of also of the Acadian-style Conférence, argues, in fact, that the anonymous author of the Acadian-style Conférence portrays the rural patois of the Paris region avec exactitude, with exactness. And in his view, it is the comedic effects of the Acadian-style Conférence do not come from deformations of patois, but they come rather from the juxtaposition of patois and French in the same texts and in the same utterances in many cases. But where patois is portrayed in Rosset's view, it is portrayed extremely accurately. So, a third view then that I'd like to mention to account for some of these apparently anomalous examples from France, this is the view of Alexander Hall, for example, is that many of these examples, many of these attestations are erroneous uses reflecting the state of degeneration of the patois after the jabot form had started to be on its way out. That is, young people heard this form, misunderstood it as a first-person singular, and began to use it that way themselves. And there is some independent evidence for this view. If you look at 37 on the handout, this is a quote from Henri Moisy's 1887 Dictionnaire de patois normand.